I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 21 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. If members could not be talking across the floor, it would be great. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on February 1st, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of science at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. For those participating by video conference, when you are ready to speak, click on the icon to activate your mic, and please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. For interpretation, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English or French. I'll remind everyone that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Before I go to witnesses, I would like to welcome, of course, the member from Saanich Gulf Islands, a person who I've come to know as a friend, Ms. May. Welcome to committee again. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses for today, of course, and apologise for the delay. There was a vote called, and of course that takes precedent over any other work that's taken place here on the Hill. And as well, I will let everybody know that we can go to 1:30, hard stop. We can't go any longer, so we will get that much of a bit of extra time. I'd now like, of course, to welcome our witnesses here today. Appearing as an individual in person, we have Mr. Greg Olford, PhD candidate and scientist, University of British Columbia. Also, virtually, we have a number of witnesses. We have Dr. Gideon Mordecai, Research Associate, Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, University of British Columbia. And as well, we have Dr. Dominique Robert, Professor and Canada Research Chair in Fisheries Ecology from the Université de Quebec à Rimouski. And the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, we have Dr. John Reynolds, Chair. From Ecometric Research Incorporated, we have Dr. Josh Corman, Fisheries Scientist. And from Ocean Networks Canada, we have Dr. Catherine Moran, President and Chief Executive Officer. I'll now go to Mr. Olford for his opening statements for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to be here today. As I understand it, my function here is to provide testimony as an ecosystem scientist. I have expertise in integrative ecology and computer simulation modeling with focus on Canada's west coast. DFO has an ecosystem science framework. In it, ecosystem science is defined as a broad approach to studying relationships and interactions in the ecosystem. It integrates science outputs. We prioritize and understand and try to understand the key relationships in nature and their links to human needs and management actions. Since 2018, I've had the privilege of conducting PhD research at the University of British Columbia's Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. This research is funded in part by DFO, and I'm an indentured public servant on education leave. Given my absence from DFO for a prolonged period, please note I'm not privy to current departmental processes and procedures, and I'm appearing today as an individual, not as a DFO spokesperson. My research is motivated by a mystery: declines in chronically low rates of marine survival of Pacific salmon in the Salish Sea since the 1970s. Specifically, I've been investigating the possible causes of low marine survival in juvenile coho and Chinook salmon. I've developed oceanographic and ecosystem simulation models with the aim of integrating and evaluating a suite of scientific hypotheses. These hypotheses were put forth by the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project, a 5-year interdisciplinary initiative. Interdisciplinary work and collaborations between institutions are essential for ecosystem science. The work thus far was made possible through resources and expertise from the Global Ocean Modeling Lab, led by Professor Willy Christensen, from international collaborators, and from DFO scientists. Support has been provided by the Pacific Salmon Foundation, DFO, UBC, the National Science and Engineering Research Council, EcoPath International, and by access to Compute Canada's high-performance computing infrastructure. The work of integrating data and science to investigate the declines in marine survival has been a daunting challenge. As you've heard, certain key hypotheses have emerged, including increased predator abundances, viruses and pathogens, declines in prey abundance or prey nutritional value, industrial pollutants and contaminants, habitat loss, and various effects related to climate regime shifts and climate change. These are all summarized in a report produced last year by scientists leading the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project. My PhD research is ongoing, and it's not yet through peer review, but I'll do my best to answer questions. Mr. Chair, with my remaining minute, I should like to emphasize the importance from an ecosystem science perspective of scoping science, essentially the process of arriving at carefully crafted questions. Quoting a popular text on adaptive management of natural resources, the most difficult step is where it's decided on what basic components are to be considered. Perhaps the most important lesson is the value of deliberately looking at the system more broadly and in somewhat more detail than initially appears worthwhile. Making progress in the field of ecosystem science requires encompassing intellectual approaches across a spectrum, ranging from reductionist to holistic. It therefore would be supportive of an ecosystem approach to management to cast a wide net, to include indigenous knowledge, fisher knowledge, local knowledge, citizen science, and other valued sources as early in the process as possible. Notably, this is aligned with the SAGE principle of inclusiveness. To wrap up, casting a wide net is not incompatible with modern ecosystem science and ecological modeling. In fact, it's necessary if we're to make a dent in understanding how these complex socio-ecological systems work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Oldford. We'll now go to Dr. Gideon Mordecai for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for inviting me to speak today. I'm a viral ecologist and geneticist at the University of British Columbia, and I work alongside a team of scientists from the Pacific Salmon Foundation and DFO. Much of my research is focused on a virus called Piscine orthoreovirus, abbreviated as PRV. I'd like to talk to you about PRV because I think it highlights some of the issues that have been raised to the committee regarding science advice. On paper, DFO sets a very high standard for scientific integrity. However, I've witnessed striking examples where DFO has failed to meet these standards in regards to the management of PRV. The story begins in Norway in the late 1990s. There were outbreaks of a new heart disease in Atlantic salmon farms. But it wasn't until over 10 years later that the virus, PRV, was discovered and implicated as the possible cause of disease. Thanks to some of the impressive research within DFO, it didn't take long for scientists to realize that this virus was also present in British Columbia. In 2011, PRV was detected by Dr. Christy Miller's lab in farm Chinook salmon that were suffering from disease. Her work was the first sign that PRV might pose a risk to Pacific salmon. As recently reported in the Globe and Mail, the public were kept in the dark about this research for 10 years. Had this work not been held back from the scientific community, perhaps some of the impact on salmon in BC from this virus may have been prevented. Since its discovery, PRV has been linked to diseases in salmon all around the world, including diseases similar to that described in the Block study.
Dr. Mordecai, could you lower your mic just a little? Translators are not hearing it. Okay, don't go down too low because it'll give static. Go up a bit from there. Okay, perfect. Continue.
There's now overwhelming evidence that PRV poses a risk to wild Pacific salmon, and salmon farming is amplifying those risks. I'll review this body of work in my written submission for you, but the take-home message is that salmon farms are a source of infection to wild salmon, and infections are linked to disease, poor health, and poor survival. Despite all this evidence, most of which was gathered by DFO scientists themselves, DFO have largely proceeded as if these findings did not exist, and conclude that farms pose minimal risk. As a consequence, salmon have not received the protection that they need. While Dr. Miller's study was being hidden, DFO managers actively supported other scientists to work with the salmon farming industry to undermine her findings, making claims that PRV does not cause disease. My scientific evaluation is that none of this work rules out the possibility or negates existing evidence that PRV can and does cause disease in salmon. PRV sent from BC to Norway has been shown to cause the same patterns of disease that occur on farms in BC. but DFO continues to ignore this result since the study was conducted in Norway. For some reason, DFO requires disease relationships to be proven within Canada. Can you imagine if we use similar thresholds in human medicine? The COVID virus would not be classified as a disease agent in Canada, since the only human challenge trial was conducted in the UK. DFO's CSAS review found that PRV cannot be the cause of disease because it can be found in healthy fish and without high mortality on farms. This is just like saying that COVID does not cause disease because some infected individuals are asymptomatic. Making such fundamental errors in reasoning makes me very concerned that DFO is not providing evidence-based science in line with their scientific integrity principles. DFO science relies on a selection of industry-funded lab studies, which place a high bar in their definition of what constitutes disease. Meanwhile, research which does find evidence of harm is ignored or suppressed. And this raises questions whether conflict of interest could have influenced how CSAS reviews were designed, interpreted, and reported. One of Canada's top fishery scientists, Geoffrey Hutchings, posed the question, are we interested in preventing disease or the semantics of whether mortality events meet the right definitions? This simple question is a powerful statement on how DFO has mismanaged this issue, using restrictive definitions and cherry-picking data to fit a narrative. DFO has repeatedly lost in court because their management of pathogens on farms is deemed unlawful, and their decision-making lacks transparency. The response from DFO officials will be that the CSAS process meets peer review standards. You've heard from previous witnesses some of the problems with the CSAS process. For instance, the panel can be dominated by participants with close ties to the industry. Normally in science, reviewers who have a conflict of interest are often excluded, especially if the conflict is financial. Would you ask a tobacco company to review the science risks concerning lung cancer? The examples this committee have heard illustrate how science advice from DFO is not always accurate, reliable, up-to-date, or free from political and commercial interference. The assessment and summary of scientific information to decision makers needs to be free from vested interests. My recommendation is for an independent fisheries science body that would be able to review and weigh evidence, especially in light of conflicts of interest. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you. We'll now go to Dr. Robert for 5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Let me briefly introduce myself. I am a professor and Canada Research Chair in Fisheries Ecology at the Université du Québec à Rimouski. As part of my research program, I regularly collaborate with Fisheries and Oceans Canada researchers from Quebec, Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Maritimes and Gulf regions. And I've participated in Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat processes in all these regions, at times as an academic researcher, and at times as an external reviewer. So I have acquired experience of these types of processes for various fish stocks in eastern Canada. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the quality of the work of DFO researchers who are highly qualified, in my opinion, to carry out the scientific work they are mandated to do. In stock assessment processes, data are rigorously presented, then conclusions are reached by consensus based on the available scientific data. However, the quality of available data varies greatly from one stock to another. Assessment of some historically and culturally important species, such as Atlantic cod in eastern Canada, is based on high-quality data from multiple sources. Other stocks, however, such as of forage species, are data deficient. Even basic data, such as their biomass, are sometimes unknown. The quality of the recommendations that scientists can therefore make are hampered as they directly depend on the data available to them. For data-deficient stocks, DFO might improve the situation were it able to set up new surveys. Though some new vessels have been added recently, the Canadian Coast Guard fleet on which DFO relies is now aging and overused. Clearly insufficient to the task of added monitoring activities. This problem is particularly acute in the Arctic regions, where increased fishing activity is expected in the years to come due to global warming. In my opinion, to better fulfill its resource assessment mandate, DFO needs modern research platforms. The rapid ecosystem changes we are experiencing due to climate change now make it a requirement to consider ecosystem variables in our stock assessments to ensure sustained resource management. The ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management is a major element of the new Fisheries Act, which was adopted in 2019. In 2019, a DFO research paper published by CSAS presented the state of play on ecosystem variables in stock assessments. This was the Pepe and his associates report published in 2019. This report concluded that out of 178 stock assessments, less than half considered ecosystem aspects, even in a qualitative way. Given the large-scale effects of climate change, it seems crucial that we immediately, in the short term, make good on the recommendations of this report. Yet, 3 years after its publication, it remains difficult, at least for me, to tell whether DFO has developed an action plan based on the report. So I recommend accelerating the implementation of an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management in Canada. An interesting point highlighted in the Pepin et al. Report is a need to better integrate the social and economic impacts of climate change into our assessments. To remain flexible and effective, science-based resource management should explicitly take into account economic and social contexts of fisheries, in addition to information about stock dynamics. The department does not currently have the capacity to do this. I would therefore recommend that economists and sociologists participate in the scientific process upstream of management decisions. Finally, I support the recommendations that several witnesses have already made in this study to the effect that a decision-making structure be established providing for a ministerial obligation to make management decisions based on scientific stock assessment conclusions and precluding any possibility of discretionary intervention. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go to Dr. Reynolds for 5 minutes or less, please.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me to participate with this standing committee. And I'm going to start by wearing my hat as a professor at Simon Fraser University and not on behalf of COSEWIC. And with that responsibility, I'll briefly remind the committee of some of the difficulties that DFO has had with translating scientific advice into management advice. And then I'll describe an alternative model for the way this might be done more appropriately based on my experiences with COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So long before I became chair of COSEWIC, I saw a long history of difficulties that DFO management had in dealing with research by my own team at Simon Fraser University and by other academics showing that wild salmon populations are harmed by sea lice emanating from salmon farms on the west coast of Canada. Dr. Bateman from the Pacific Salmon Foundation described some of those issues to this committee last week, and you just heard from Dr. Mordecai about similar issues with the effects of viruses. Until recently, there's been a consistent pattern of denial of the harm caused to wild salmon by salmon farming, which suggested to me as a salmon biologist that policy preferences were affecting science advice rather than the other way around. The other example that I'll very briefly mention involving DFO's struggle to generate independent science advice comes from the case of endangered steelhead trout in British Columbia. Again, the committee has heard already from others about that. I won't go into details, but the key issue is that although DFO convened a panel of federal and provincial scientists and industry stakeholders to review the fish's status and potential for recovery, the advice to the minister that came from this review reduced the emphasis on the role of bycatch salmon fisheries as an ongoing threat to steelhead. And bycatch management I'll remind you, is DFO's responsibility. So this is another example where there's been an issue when it comes to the translation of peer-reviewed science advice into management advice. So, Mr. Chair, I mentioned these two examples, as I said, from my vantage point as a professor at Simon Fraser University. I had no idea that I would eventually become the chair of CSIWIC, where I learned about a model for greater independence and transparency. Members of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada are appointed by the Minister of the Environment, and we are explicitly directed to provide independent advice. And that independence is enshrined in the Species at Risk Act, and it is reiterated in the ministerial appointment letters that we receive. Many of the members, including myself, are volunteers. Others contribute as part of their day jobs as endangered species experts employed by provinces, territories, and federal agencies. Now, our status reports undergo 3 rounds of extensive independent peer review, and our meetings where we decide on the status of threatened species are open to observers. The results of our work are used not only by the federal government for decisions about protection and recovery under the Species at Risk Act, but also by a much wider audience of people who have a shared interest in conservation. So, for example, when DFO announced in June of 2021 the creation of a $647 million Pacific salmon strategy, CSIWIC's determinations of the status of salmon were mentioned explicitly. So, as the good news is that as chair of CSIWIC, I am very pleased to report that our collaborations with DFO scientists on status reports of aquatic species have been very positive. We have 2 DFO scientists appointed to our committee, and we work closely with them and many others on aquatic species. So the interactions with DFO at the science level have always been very positive, and I'm grateful for the help and expertise that DFO brings to our shared enterprise. But the key to our success is that we all follow a hard directive to provide unbiased, independent science advice, where we ignore our day jobs or any potential desired outcomes that others may have. Mr. Chair, I suggest that a similar directive could run from DFO science through to management. Specifically, DFO could adopt a prime directive where management objectives are expressly prohibited from influencing science, and there could be checks and balances along the way to ensure that that is occurring. Science and management should also be fully transparent, with all documents involved in decision-making publicly available and subject to peer review from outside of DFO. I believe if these principles of world-class science were also applied to transparent decisions for management, this would lead to improved outcomes for the conservation of aquatic biodiversity and sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to Dr. Corman for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to be a witness today. I'd like to begin by providing a brief summary of my background. I'm a fishery scientist that runs a small consulting company in Vancouver, and I'm an adjunct professor at University of BC. My work focuses on the effects of dams and harvesting on the population dynamics of salmon, steelhead, and trout. I've been an author on 7 papers that have gone through the CSAS or PSARC review process, and I've also acted as a reviewer on a number of occasions. I believe the main reason I was asked to appear before this committee is because I'm the senior author on the Emergency Recovery Potential Assessment for Interior Fraser River steelhead that was reviewed under CSAS in 2018 that Dr. Reynolds just mentioned. From my experience with CSAS, the review process of working papers is actually quite rigorous. I have not observed that unsupported advice from DFO Fisheries Management or outside parties has unduly influenced CSAS working papers or their final versions. However, I have observed substantive meddling by DFO in the conversion of our Recovery Potential Assessment Report for Interior Fraser Steelhead into the Scientific Advice Report, or SAR. A SAR is intended to summarize the key findings of CSAS papers and serves as a central document that provides management advice. There were 2 main conclusions from our final recovery report relevant to management advice. First, reductions in the abundance of seals and sea lions was deemed to be the most effective way of recovering steelhead populations. This fundamental conclusion was substantially altered by DFO when they wrote the SAR. For example, they stated there was no consensus that there is a causal relationship between the 2, meaning a relation between steelhead and seals and sea lions. This directly contradicts our final report, where multiple lines of evidence for the relationship between steelhead and seals and sea lions was presented. And I don't recall hearing substantiated objections
On
to
n'a
our
pas la
conclusions.
traduction.
Okay,
Désolé.
one
During
second,
the
Dr.
CSAS
Corman.
present-
1 second, Dr. Corman. Madame Debienne?
Je n'ai pas la traduction simultanée. Désolé.
I'm very sorry, I'm not hearing the translation into French.
D'accord, alors c'est peut-être le débit qui est trop rapide.
Perhaps the speaker was speaking too quickly for the interpreter to follow.
A note, Dr. Corman, we're having trouble translating for some of our participants here today. So the interpreters are asking you if you could slow down a little bit, maybe move your mic down just slightly. Usually it's me people are telling to slow down, but today I have to tell you to do it.
I'm sorry
for
about
the
that.
interpreters. Thank
I'll
you.
talk a bit slower. Thank you.
Continue.
Thank you. So I don't recall hearing any substantiated objections to our conclusions during the CSAS proceedings, but I can't document this discrepancy because the proceedings are still not available. Second, the recovery potential report showed that the predicted trajectories of steelhead populations were relatively insensitive to reductions in steelhead, bycatch, and salmon fisheries. This occurred because the current harvest rates on steelhead are estimated to be relatively low, at
Monsieur le
approximately
Président, je suis
15.
désolée.
I'm very sorry, Chair. Once again, I'm going to speak up because the interpretation is not coming through.
Okay, we'll just check with interpretation for a moment before
Juste donner
we
peut-être un petit peu de
start
temps à nos
again.
interprètes, juste pour être...
Perhaps give a moment to the interpreters to just ensure that they're able to start in again.
Okay, we're going to try this again, but I would ask Dr. Corman if he could back up a little bit to enable the translation for our members of committee. Mr. Small, I don't think you've got the floor, so I'd appreciate some
J'en
silence,
profiterai,
please.
Monsieur le Président, pour remercier la traduction.
I would like to thank the interpreters while I'm at it, Mr. Chair. They work so well. It's exceptional what they're able to do. It's not always easy to follow along, especially given the speed of the speakers, so I would like to thank them.
Yep, duly noted. So if you could start somewhere a little bit back from where we ended, Dr. Corman, it would be much appreciated.
Sure. Second, the recovery potential report showed that predicted trajectories of steelhead populations were relatively insensitive to reductions in steelhead bycatch in salmon fisheries. This occurred because the current harvest rates on steelhead are estimated to be relatively low at approximately 15 to 20%. However, given the unequivocal and severe conservation concern for interior Fraser steelhead, an immediate reduction in bycatch mortality is a logical potential action that the minister could take. In writing the SAR, some at DFO tried to head off this potential outcome by stating, allowable harm should not be permitted to exceed current levels, We never said this in the final recovery potential document. We said exploitation should be reduced below current levels whenever possible. It is worth noting that the recommendation to maintain status quo bycatch of steelhead in the SAR is inconsistent with what DFO has done to protect weak salmon populations. For example, DFO responded to the 1998 coho crisis by imposing very substantive fisheries closures. Substantive closures to protect cultists like sockeye and more recently Fraser River Chinook have also been implemented. DFO decisions thus appear risk-averse for protecting weak salmon populations, but not so for protecting weak steelhead ones. In summary, the main conclusions from the SAR for interior Fraser steelhead are not consistent with the main findings of the final recovery potential report. The SAR de-emphasized the importance of seal and sea lion predation and promoted the idea that status quo salmon fishing is okay. In my view, the first modification on effects of seals and sea lions is the most problematic because it misrepresents the primary tool available to us to improve the status of interior Fraser steelhead and likely for Chinook and other salmon. In closing, I emphasize with the challenges that DFO and the minister faces when making very difficult trade-off decisions for conservations of weak populations versus salmon fishing. Given this trade-off, it is hard to understand why DFO appears so reluctant to consider control of seal and sea lion populations on the south coast of BC. I believe we need a more transparent process where the rationale for conservation and fishing decisions made by DFO can be evaluated by the public to determine if the decisions are consistent and also compatible with existing policies on harvesting and conservation. Thanks for your attention and interest.
Thank you, Dr. Corman, and thank you for your patience. We'll now go to Dr. Moran for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I'll start by saying that even though the sign behind me says Nova Scotia, and I love all of Canada's three coasts, I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people here in Victoria, British Columbia. And as you've seen, I'm President and CEO of Ocean Networks Canada, but my background is oceanography and ocean engineering and not biology or ecosystem science. Ocean Networks Canada operates world-leading cabled ocean observatories in Canada's Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic oceans, and we collect and deliver real-time data for scientific research, for societal benefits and industry. Through our unique data management system, Oceans 3, data from our observatories are collected in all forms, quality assured, and archived. We make all of our data open and freely available to Canadians and anyone in the world, for which I would be happy to elaborate further during question period, because it is my view that open data, data products, and results are the core foundation for informing policy and management decisions. In the 16 years of operations, Ocean Networks Canada has supported 20,000 plus global users, including many DFO scientists. We currently host 9,000 sensors, many of which are Canadian made, and Oceans 3.0 has collected more than a petabyte of data, which is big data. As a major science initiative with an operating budget on the order of $27 million a year, we receive funding from the Canada Foundation for Innovation for 60% of those dollars through ISED, and 40% from the delivery of essential national data products and services that align and help with the federal government achieve departmental mandates, including DFO's mandate under the Oceans Protection Plan and for ocean protection in the soon-to-be expanded marine protected areas. For example, Ocean Networks Canada operates high-frequency coastal radar and underwater microphones called hydrophones. These high-frequency radars are on land and look out over vast areas of the surface ocean in areas such as the Port of Vancouver, Port of Prince Rupert, and Halifax, where real-time surface current data are provided for users that help to make the marine system safe. The hydrophones are sensors that listen to underwater noise and are essential for reducing noise and for understanding species at risk and their habitats, including here on the West Coast, the southern resident killer whales. Another example of Ocean Networks Canada's long-time series data particularly are important for scientific contributions to DFO. For 16 years, we've captured and provided essential ocean variables that help provide scientific evidence to ocean changes and anomalies caused by climate change. This includes areas such as Canada's first marine protected area, the Endeavour Ridge, and much of DFO's current Pacific area of interest. Ocean Networks Canada also provides data support during DFO expeditions, scientific expeditions, and marine protected area expeditions, and Indigenous community outreach and engagement. One of Ocean Networks Canada's most successful programs supported by DFO is our Community Fishers program. These are partnerships with communities, mostly Indigenous, who collect data from their own vessels of opportunity. We will be expanding this program even further across Canada's coast over the next 4 years through DFO support to empower our Indigenous communities to collect their own data and to do that on behalf of Canada as stewards of our coasts. The ocean crosses many departments. With the creation of the Oceans Protection Plan, it was perhaps the first time that Canada developed a multi-department ocean approach to deliver this 5-year program. Today, however, there's a heightened need for cross-department collaboration in the Arctic Ocean and in the rest of Canada's coast, but in the Arctic Ocean specifically, because it is the home to our longest part of our coastline, which is the longest in the world. With the extreme climate-induced changes that are occurring in the ocean, Arctic security and sovereignty must be a top priority for DFO and other federal departments. I have some experience in this area. Before I came to BC, I was working in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy under the Obama administration, where I served as Associate Director, focusing on many areas, but including the Arctic and climate policy issues. During this time, I helped develop the first U.S. national ocean policy across multiple agencies, more than 25 departments and entities. I think it is past time for Canada to take this approach to marshal and leverage assets across the federal family and in partnership with ocean infrastructure operators like Ocean Networks Canada and others along other coasts. And I'll just close by saying I'd be happy to talk more about our strength in data and how data and open data can help achieve very rich and robust management decisions for the ocean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moran. That concludes the statements by witnesses. We'll now go to our rounds of questioning by members. I will ask members to please identify who you're directing your question to make best use of your time. We have 6 witnesses today, and there's nothing worse than having everybody steer at the screen or steer at one another. So we'll start off with Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less. And I will make a note that Dr. Reynolds he's got a hard stop at 1 o'clock our time. So if you have questions for Dr. Reynolds, you might want to get him in before that time slot. So Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all 6 witnesses for participating in this important study. I'll start off with a question to Mr. Mordecai and Mr. Corman. Based on your experiences working around fisheries science in the Pacific region, what have your observations been in terms of how DFO plans, resources, and handles science meant to support the decision of the department and the minister? Perhaps Mr. Mordecai first.
Thank you for the question. I suppose I covered, sorry, I'm hearing lots of feedback. I suppose I covered much of my points in my statement. I guess I'd focus on instances where, we've heard of science coming from DFO scientists themselves, whether that's through a CSAS process or through, internal communication of science, and that science not making its way to the management decision. So, we've heard different examples of how at various stages there can be a block of information. And I think that's where the committee needs to focus on making sure the science information can get to the decision makers without that block. And I'll leave time for Dr. Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Corman.
Yeah, my experiences with stock assessment, counting salmon and harvest and determining harvest rates. That's principally the work I've done with DFO. The challenge is that there's a heck of a lot of salmon streams and inadequate funding to monitor them. And, that has varied over the administrations with the amount of funding DFO has gotten. And there's cases where they've been explicitly directed to collect better data, such as in the Interior Fraser Coho crisis, where 20 years later, when we go to look at the new data, and we realize that, the better stock assessment was not done. And, I'm not close enough to the department to know how much of that is to do with funding and how much of that is to do with problems within the department. I suspect some mix is possible, but I think a common theme is that sort of promises are made to do better science, and looking at that in the fullness of time, you see that often that doesn't work out.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Corman. Can you provide any suggestions or recommendations on how the process of determining what science should be undertaken and how that eventual information and data is relayed up to the decision-making process in the department or the minister's office? How the system could be improved?
Yeah, I really...
I guess we heard from Mr. Reynolds about a more independent process. Any thoughts on that yourself?
Yeah, with regards to making the decisions from science and translating that into management, I agree with the sentiments of a number of panelists today. We need some sort of firewall or independence to confirm that what the science says is translated into the management advice. And this for one thing, in our case, it could have been done by letting the authors of our Steelhead report make the first crack at the management advice. We were excluded from writing that document. So there's some obvious things that can be done to better strengthen the linkage between the management advice and the science.
Thank you. Again, for you, Mr. Corman, you provided evidence to the Cohen Commission that showed that the short data record at the time meant that there was very low statistical power of the data to show potential relationships between salmon farm variables and measures of sockeye health and productivity. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Cohen also accepted your evidence that, and that of Dr. Dill, that scientists needed another 10 years of regulatory data until at least the mid-2020 before they could more confidently identify any relationships that might exist. Would that be correct?
Yes.
I see you nodding. Thank you. In your opinion, has the data record been established since the Cohen Commission that can confidently identify impacts of BC salmon farms on wild salmon?
Well, there's been substantive research since that time, and you've heard some of it in Dr. Miller Saunders' testimony and others. So I think progress has been made. The challenge is that the questions they're trying to answer are very, very difficult. So throwing more money at it and even cutting edge research is going to make it very difficult to ultimately establish how disease transfers from farms to wild fish and how that translates into survival and ultimately returns of salmon. Very, very tough question. So I think some progress has been made, but clearly not enough to make some, strong science-based decisions on the farms. There's a lot of uncertainty about their impacts at this point, and I believe that uncertainty is going to remain for quite a while, just due to the challenge of the questions that they face, in spite of the good research that's being done.
Okay, thank you. In your opinion, then, a decade after the Cohen report, where is DFO at in completion the study between interactions between salmon farms and wild salmon?
Gee, I would pass that off to Dr. Mordecai or others that have been closer with that. They certainly have made some progress. Of course, you've heard the controversy about whether these 8 or 9 SARs on salmon farm risk were accurate or not, and there's quite a bit of debate. I haven't been close enough to know, but I certainly look at research by Dr. Miller and others, Dr. Mordecai, and there's certainly good work being done. Progress is being made. I just think it's a hard question to answer.
Thank you,
I
Mr.
think my
Arnold.
time's
Gone a
up.
little bit over. I'm trying to be as strict as I can today with such short time. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Fascinating testimony from everybody so far today. We'll start with you, Dr. Mordecai. You noted in your article in the newspaper that the consensus model was the mechanism that actually was a barrier to Dr. Miller-Saunders' research ever seeing the light of day. She mentioned this as well. That must have been put in place for a reason. Can you give us a sense as to why it might have been there, and more importantly, what an alternative to that model should look like?
You know, I can't speak to the CSAS process. I wasn't there in person. As scientists, we're used to having conflicting data sets. This is not a novel problem. I think there are better ways of dealing with that. I'm not sure a consent.
What do those better ways look like, sir?
Well, you know, in science, we have independent peer review, and if we have someone who's truly independent from a process, they'll be able to weigh up the different data sets and try and come to a conclusion, and recognizing that uncertainty and some transparency over that uncertainty. The problem with the CSAS process, I believe, was that because the panel was dominated by one type of person with links to the industry, the consensus didn't reflect the complexities in that data and the different findings. And some of that, I think, within that consensus process, some of the important work which has been done and those conclusions found were kind of, those ideas were suppressed.
From what we've heard this morning, there's the scientific advice report, the SAR, and then there's the consensus model in the development of the science. Would it be your opinion, I'll put words in your mouth, I can't ask the question any other way, would it be your opinion, Dr. Mordecai, that those are two filters that actually prevents necessary information to getting to the minister?
You know, I'd focus on a mechanism to have transparency throughout these processes. So, you know, the CSAS, if the review process needs to be open and transparent, we can see what information is going in, we can see what information is coming out and being fed to the decision maker. You know, as scientists, if we know that the information is getting to the decision maker, but they base their decision based on a variety of other factors, we at least know the science has been considered. That's currently not the case, and I think that's the root of the problem. So I'd say focus on transparency would go a long way in helping those issues.
Thank you. Question for Dr. Reynolds. You know, in earlier studies, it was mentioned that you could take all of the scientists involved here, lay them end to end, and they would never reach a conclusion. And that is a critical issue because, you know, we need to know from your standpoint what kind of advice is possible to give to a minister. With all of the uncertainties, with all of the unknowns, what would a minister actually hear from science in the process of trying to make a decision? Would there be just, here's the data, or would there be recommendations? Like, what would that look like, or what could it look like, given all of the factors that scientists have to deal with?
Thank you. In cases like this, I think there are two issues that can help with this. First is a precautionary principle can be adopted. So if it looks like there could be a problem, then the precautionary principle would suggest that you should assume there may well be one. So that doesn't mean that you necessarily shut everything down. You don't. Perhaps the recommendation to the minister would not go that far if there's so much uncertainty that we have to invoke the precautionary principle. But that it's well known that we should not be using that as a reason for inaction. The other way to deal with this, though, is to look at the weight of evidence. We do that in science all the time. So you could try to shoot down an individual study, say, oh, it's just a correlation, for example. But eventually, the number of studies that are all pointing in the same direction by independent researchers could become overwhelming. And so the advice to the minister could be that There is uncertainty in a complex problem, but the weight of evidence points to this, and therefore here are your potential options.
I wonder how much of that would actually take place, given that every time a minister makes a decision, there's going to be somebody who doesn't like the decision popping up and saying, well, no, we've got science that says that's all wrong, that you shouldn't do that. And this does lead then to something that Mr. Arnold mentioned in his very first question, which I think is very critical. He talked about, science supporting decisions. And that seems to me to be backwards in a sense. Shouldn't it be decisions supported by science? Because the first way, science supporting decisions, that's the Fraser Institute model of research. Sorry. And it is just simply the wrong way to go at it. Would you agree, Dr. Reynolds?
Yes, I think that the science comes first, and the science can point toward the state of the problem, if you think of it as a problem, and it can also be used to consider potential solutions. And so, for example, Dr. Corman mentioned that they wrote that report, which would have also modeled, the effects of different potential management actions on benefiting the steelhead. So you can model or advise on what the potential options are and what are most likely to be effective. The minister then can take that information about the options and what the science is that are supporting those options, and then bring in these other factors that of course they have to consider, the trade-offs, the people who will be harmed or by the management actions, for example. And as long as that's done in a transparent, open way so that people can see where the science enters and what other factors were being considered, then that would certainly be a process that I think a lot of people could sign up to.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. This is shedding a good deal of light on matters. I would like to speak to Mr. Robert. I think there's something of the highest interest in what you've brought us here about other sciences, sociology, ecology, or economics, which could improve or provide a more adapted approach to DFO decisions that are reflect sociological realities. Are you telling us that there are no sociologists or economists who are shedding further light on decisions taken by DFO at this point? Well, there are no sociologists or ecologists present when stocks are evaluated. Considering models adopted in other countries, such as in France, through IFRAMER, which is the equivalent of our Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Canada, has specialists in economics, social sciences, who are involved in the evaluation process. Here, we consider science to be biology, fisheries science, stock management science. Good enough, but when that information is handed over to management, there is no further addition by, sciences, social sciences, basically, economic science. Decisions can be very harmful to communities given that there is no such filter applied, no such lens. The socioeconomic system is not taken into account in the decision-making process. I couldn't agree more. Back to herring and mackerel. Out on the field, of course, we hear about so much human suffering, and I think that DFO would do well to take into account not only fish but also humans when it comes to managing our fisheries. So I understand this would be one of your main recommendations, and that you also recommend that we provide better basic equipment to our scientists, such as vessels, in order to ensure that they can cover the Arctic region. Is this something you would like to say more about what's missing right now? Yes, indeed. A good deal these days is said about certain species, such as salmon. And these are data-rich programs. There are a good deal of research programs underway on these species, given that they're bring in money, they're culturally and economically important to Canada. But there are a number of forage species in eastern Canada, a number of stocks there that we don't even know the biomass of. To understand the biomass of a forage fish, well, you do need considerable technology to do that, acoustic assessment, fleets, and right now the Coast Guard is 100% monopolized to carry out the research currently underway. There's even difficulty at present repairing the ships, given that they have to be kept out at sea. So this is a real issue. If we wish to offer better scientific advice, an ecosystem-based approach, but without important elements of the ecosystem, such as forage species, then will always remain uncertain. There will be an ongoing risk, as has been said by many. The more uncertainty there is in the scientific data and the completeness of the data, more you're going to make management errors. So I think our ability to maintain our scientific presence at sea is at issue here. According to your reading of the situation, a good deal is now being made of seals and sea lions. And to your mind, do you think this is the fish's worst enemy, or are there other enemies we need to be taking into account? Well, of course, people who know the southern part of the St. Lawrence Gulf are aware that the seal population has grown considerably. And the seal is the principal predator in the system at present. And is one of the main reasons that many fish stock are failing. But let's not forget fishing as well. Mackerel was mentioned a little earlier. This is an example I know a good deal about, given that I wrote my thesis on the mackerel at a point in time when the stock was still doing well. For about a decade now, the stock evaluation reports from DFO are mentioning that the pressure from fishers is excessive on this species. It took a good deal of time before the fishery was closed for this particular species, for the mackerel. So we were mentioning the independence of models. Mr. Reynolds gave us an excellent description of that. We need to ensure that our management decisions represent or based on the real situation rather than sort of pushing hard decisions off into the future. You get situations where suddenly you're closing down the mackerel fisheries. It is the right decision given the state of the stock at the time and the biomass, but this should have been a gradual process and started earlier.
Ms. Barron, for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today, both in person and virtually. My first question I wanted to ask Dr. Mordecai. Since the decision, it's been about a year and a half now, I believe, since the decision by the previous Minister Jordan to close the fish farms in Discovery Islands. And I know that there has been research conducted since that time, in particular your research around aquaculture mediates global transmission of viral pathogens to wild salmon, also a recent paper by Dr. Bateman. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on the research that you've done, and curious to get your thoughts as to whether the decisions being made currently are using the most up-to-date available science.
So I guess I'd summarize the science and say pathogens like PRV and Tenacibaculum, we know they're very common on farms. We know they're being transmitted from farms to wild fish, and we're beginning to understand, and in some cases, for example, with PRV, it's very clear that they're linked to disease. A more recent paper, which ranked all the different pathogens, and trying to consider if these pathogens have an impact on the cohort survival or the body condition, so the healthiness of fish. And of all the different pathogens that we study, the two which came out on top were Tenacibaculum and PRV, so the two pathogens which are most closely associated with farms. So I think the science is becoming more and more clear that there is an impact, and we can start to investigate this impact on populations. Your second half of your question was about the science review process. My experience since publishing my paper that you mentioned on PRV is that these findings are not being considered. I see no evidence that these are being used in the science. There hasn't been any official science review processes, and there's not much transparency in what happens on the inside. What I can tell you is that for a virus like PRV, with all these links to disease that I've described, DFO will still do not consider it as a disease agent. So they're making decisions sometimes internally which go against the international consensus on pathogens such as PRV.
Thank you, Dr. Mordecai. Could you also expand a little bit on the concept of minimal risk? We know that we see many different threats that together pose, have a compounding effect together. And I'm wondering if you can, if you agree with what I've just said, and if you can expand a little bit around how the process of utilizing minimal risk perhaps impacts the ability to use research like yours in decision-making processes.
I'd like to point out those risk assessments were only carried out for one species of salmon, and we expect there to be differences between species. They were only carried out for one population, Fraser River sockeye. I was in a ministerial roundtable 2 days ago where the minister herself expressed that she didn't agree with, she couldn't see how those risk assessments found minimal risk when they hadn't been considered altogether. So there are clearly issues with the way that risk assessment was carried out, but also how it's being used and extrapolated across all the different species of salmon. And, as the minister rightly pointed out, how they're not being considered together and how the impacts might be cumulative. I'll leave more time for questions, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, Mr. Oldford, if you have any thoughts around the use of minimal risk and how it impacts our decision-making processes.
I guess I can share my reflections on what I'm hearing today, that it's very difficult to tease apart cause and effects in situations where we see a lot of correlation. And I think scientists and researchers struggle with that, and politicians and managers will be struggling with that kind of an issue for a long time. But as other witnesses have mentioned, there are mechanisms such as the weight of evidence approach. There's a precautionary approach as well that can help us navigate the situation when uncertainty is always there.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was turning off my microphone. I have another question to Dr. Mordecai. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit around any international standards that we should consider in our processes. Just thinking, for example, the Magnuson-Stevens Act in the U.S. Just wondering if you can expand a little bit on that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'd like to reflect on the last comment as well, and just say that a causal relationship isn't required to make a precautionary decision. But yeah, it's true. There are internationally there are fisheries science review processes which incorporate independent science advice into fisheries management. And there are examples we can look to in the US, in the EU, in Australia, New Zealand, which have that independent aspect to them. I'd say, in a sense, Canada is falling behind internationally in that sense. And obviously, not all these processes are necessarily immune to political interference, but the fact that you have an independent body is at least a step in the right direction. And if there's some transparency in the way those decisions are made, it makes it much easier for other scientists looking in from the outside to review how these decisions are being made. So, you can look up in Europe, they have groups of experts which are appointed by an independent commission for 3 years who provide scientific advice on fisheries management. And I think this is pretty similar to the kind of example that Dr. Reynolds was putting forward with Coswick.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, witnesses. This has been fascinating so far. My first questions, a couple of questions are for Dr. Reynolds in your position as chair of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife, as we all call COSUIT. My first question is, obviously we're most interested here in the aquatic species element of what you do. When there is a consideration going on within your process, is it possible that a species would have perhaps some sort of endangered status in one part of the country and not another? And does your process allow for that distinction?
Yes, it does happen that species have different statuses in different parts of the country, especially such a large and diverse country as ours. We look for the overall national status. So we ask, all things considered, how are they doing? So, for example, peregrine falcon is doing extremely well in nearly all of the country, but there are certainly some places where it has not recovered from pesticides. But overall, the peregrine falcon as a species was deemed by my committee to no longer be at risk of extinction, and it has therefore we don't need to be running that through the federal program.
Great example. So in that example, even though it may be in danger in one part, you still did an overall designation. So if I were to bring up Elvers, which is something I think that's before COSUIC right now, we know that it has some challenges in the Great Lakes, mainly because of hydroelectric dams throughout Quebec and Ontario in terms of preventing their migration and spawning routes. But in Atlantic Canada, Elvers are very healthy. I've been told by the minister that any consideration of it by COSUIC has to be done uniformly across the country. So you would say that that's incorrect?
We would do. It is correct. We would be considering all of the separate populations and how they're doing in different places, and then ask overall how is that species doing on a Canada-wide basis.
Okay.
If I should add one, may I add one thing
please
I should have said? Sorry. We do consider species below the species level. We can look at subspecies, or we can look at genetically distinct populations. So, for example, if the fish are doing, fish in Atlantic Canada are bound to be genetically distinct, or may well be genetically distinct from ones in the Great Lakes. In that case, we would actually look at those two, you could call them subspecies, we call them designatable units. We will assess each of those separately, and it's possible for one of them then to be listed for protection under the Species at Risk Act, and the other one could be deemed to be not at risk.
That's very important, because in the study that's ongoing now on that's the distinction I've been trying to make with the department, which I am not getting very far on. But in the, do you have any idea of the timing of how long this is going to take? There's a lot of commercial businesses at stake in Atlantic Canada. And my understanding is that there's going to be some ELVR decisions made by the Food and Drug Administration this year in the United States that are going to allow for the growth and development of the ELVR business in the U.S. very quickly, and we may be left behind if we aren't through the COSOIC process soon.
I see. I would have to check with the Secretariat. The COSOIC meeting is actually going on right now for the spring meeting. I can provide that information to the committee after this hearing, if you like, just so I can see exactly what stage in the process we are. At any given time, we have about 100 species working their way through our process, so I just don't know offhand.
That'd be great. Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Robert. Dr. Robert, you mentioned that the quality varies between species, particularly in what you've been used to in terms of Atlantic Canada and the research that's been ongoing. I'd like to talk about a couple of issues. One is when you have pelagic fish, obviously having a full acoustic sounding of the biomass is very helpful, and when you do it and what the water temperature is when you do that, or spawning biomass is very important. But there are a number of species, important species, such as Atlantic mackerel, which we just saw the department close down, that do not have acoustic sounding, and that the examination of the science over the spawning biomass, or the spawning sampling that DFO has been doing over the last decade has shown that they're actually sampling when the water is at 8 degrees Celsius in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and not at the 10 to 13 that's required for spawning, which is underestimating the potential size of the biomass. So could you comment on is that one of the areas or species where we are a little short on the quality of the science?
Well, Atlantic mackerel, yeah, you're right. It doesn't have an acoustic survey, but given its biology, it's not the best species to consider with acoustics because it doesn't have a swim bladder, so it's not a good acoustic target. However, the department runs an egg survey, so they monitor the number of eggs spawned during the short spawning season in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence. And as you mentioned, of course, the spawning can vary a little bit from a year to another, depending on temperature. The survey doesn't vary in time, but there is sampling of the females as well to account and correct for the mismatch. And I know that the department has explored other potential spawning areas like the west coast of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia also. So in my view, the survey for Atlantic mackerel for its biomass is a good one. It's a good one compared to many other forage fish stocks. So I would, of course, there is uncertainty, but when I read the reports, for the stock assessment reports, I very much trust the conclusions about its abundance and the fact that the mortality on the adult component was too high right now.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. We're gone way over with Mr. Perkins, so we'll go now to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to follow up with Dominic Robert on the same issue because it's one that's very current today in Atlantic Canada. So would I be interpreting you correct then that the decision made by the department and the minister as it relates to closing the mackerel fishery was a sound decision in the best interest of the rebuilding of the stock?
Yeah, that's what I conclude. The stock is its level of biomass is very low. The issue is not only with commercial fishing; it's also with the bait fishery, which is not well accounted for in all regions. So it's difficult really to estimate the mortality through fishing. We know that, and this is a DFO science, that the the status of the ecosystem is not very favorable right now for the production of good year classes to replenish the stock. So the way to go is really to decrease as much as possible the fishing pressure, allow a certain level of biomass to remain, and that certain level of biomass, when the conditions will get back to something better, will be able to generate some new cohorts. So the decision is good, but it could have probably been made with more planning and maybe before this year. I think it came by surprise to the industry, and not a good surprise.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. And following up on that, my concern is with the management of fish stock, the management of fish stock as it relates to the fishers, workers, and communities, because they depend on government, DFO getting it right. So how would you recommend to this committee that government bridge the conflict between fish harvesters, local observations, and the DFO science? And as you just said, it wasn't well received, but from the independent scientific data that you've examined, the department made a prudent decision for the long-term sustainability of the resource, which our communities and fishers depend on. Could you comment?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the options that could be considered is a branch for social sciences within the department, because really sometimes we tend to forget that a fish stock is not just a fish stock. It sometimes represents the vitality, the economy of some communities, and just looking at the number, stopping a fishery is, of course, will impact people. So, but there must be. I'm not a social scientist myself, but there must be ways to prepare communities. For example, in perhaps redesigning the system in allowing people to fish several species. So when one is doing poorly, perhaps we can have some resilience by exploiting other species that are doing better. And that's a bit the problem right now in Atlantic Canada. The system is shifting from a cold one to a warm one, and some of the species are disappearing quickly, and some others are booming. So it's sort of a regime shift, and this brings some uncertainty for our fishing communities.
If you could comment on one, there's been a lot of testimony given about an independent science branch within DFO. How would you, and if you could present it in written later to committee, how would you advise the committee that an independent science branch only focused on science would then interpret the information from the knowledge base, which is the fishers, indigenous communities, and take into account? How would it work? And I would be curious, I know I don't have time now, if you have an opinion that you could provide to the committee on paper. Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Your evidence is fascinating.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. We'll now go to Madame Devienne for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will continue to question Mr. Robert. Dr. Robert, you mentioned your thesis on the herring and mackerel. For how long have you been seeing a diminishing biomass of this resource? When it comes to mackerel, the last strong year class that we saw was in 99, which was what I studied in my thesis. Since then, the cohorts have been of moderate size, and since 2010, weak. The recruitment is quite weak, and the adults are fewer and fewer. For herring in the southern part of the Gulf, since 2000, it's been in decline. And herring is a species that has spawns twice in the fall and in the spring, and sometimes if it's too warm, it doesn't spawn in the spring. Tell me, was your thesis filed with the DFO, let's say 10 years ago or whenever you did complete it? Yes, quite a few years ago. My research was basic research. I was looking to understand the link between the growth of larvae and the survival of the fish stock. We now know that large cohorts are really decided at the larva stage. These are factors that really count. Whatever allows the larva to survive will have a considerable effect on what survives to be fished 5 years down the road. So the conditions in the southern part of the Gulf are not great for mackerel, but the system is very variable, of course, the ecological system. There's some hope that this stock may recover, but we'll have to take care of it to ensure it does. That's all, Mr. Chair.
7 seconds left so, in your time. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I guess just first question I wanted to clarify, is it Ms. Moran or Dr. Moran? I want to make sure I'm using the right title.
It's Dr. Moran.
Dr. Moran. Thank you, Dr. Moran. Dr. Moran, you spoke quite a bit about the importance of having open and freely available data and that it was a core foundation for informing policy and management. We had Chief Science Advisor Dr. Mona Niemer here last week, and she highlighted some of the challenges in having open and available data. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more around how Oceans Network Canada uses government data and how a more transparent system would help in your efforts.
Well, thank you for that question, because I'd like to bring up some experience we've had with DFO after the Baum and Fuller report came out in 2016, Canada's Marine Fisheries Status, Recovery, Potential, and Pathways, and DFO Pacific Science worked with us, and we actually developed what we call a fisheries science reporting system that addressed the recommendations from that report and addressed some of the comments here from the other witnesses. In fact, it provides scientific information, trajectory information about species, economic value, abundant species, life cycle information, geography, etc. And it also links to all of the open data, both in the federal government and in academic publications. And we developed it because we are a big data enterprise. We were able to developing this tool, and we were on to phase 3 when there has been no action since 2018. We see this as a national tool that could then begin to open this transparency, and it would begin to look like what the US NOAA does in their fisheries service, where they actually have a very open and transparent delivery of data across all species and stock. It's called Stock Smart. And this would allow all of us to have that information, including the lack of assessment data, which I think has been brought up here again. So I think this could be a way forward. We'd be happy to work again with Fisheries and Ocean Science across the country to advance this tool, to open up that transparency so that everyone understands on both the social science side and the hard science side, what are the gaps in that information and what kind of risks are we taking in making these decisions. I also want to touch on the fact that there was a comment about where do we bring in the fishers themselves? And there's a model in the US called Sea Grant, where in fact they are really funding regionally the interest of the fishers. What science do they need to help them advance their economic benefit? That might be a model to look at going forward. And finally, I'd like to comment on the fact that we will not have a lot of ships to capture a lot of these data in the open ocean and in some of the coastal areas. And we are not now moving forward with looking at systems, autonomous surface vehicles, because we can no longer afford to operate these vessels with people on board. And this is the future, and it's been advancing in the past 3 years. Many publications on how these autonomous vehicles are now being used for stock assessment and understanding of evolution of species as climate changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Olford. Thank you very much, Mr. Olford, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come in here and help out with our study. I heard you mention that there's been a big decrease in salmon population in the Salish Sea since the 70s. What year did the United States bring in the Marine Mammal Protection Act?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'm not 100% what year that was, but my guess is it's early 1970s.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure. Maybe it was 72. I'm not sure, but I think it was the 70s. So prior to the introduction of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, well, we all know that pinnipeds are big predators of salmon. Do you think that basically the elimination of control on pinniped population has affected predation in coastal British Columbia?
I think I can attempt to answer your question. The facts that we know about pinnipeds in the Salish Sea are that the numbers have increased since the early 1970s. There may have been around a couple of thousand of harbor seals, for example, and today there may be more like 40,000 or so. So it's been a very big increase. This has happened in parallel with many other species of marine mammal. Killer whales, sea lions, sea otters, humpback whales. Bigg's killer whale or West Coast transient are predators of pinnipeds as well. So there's been a big increase in numbers of those groups. You mentioned that they prey upon salmon. We do know that is a fact, that juvenile coho and chinook may comprise 1% to maybe 6% of the harbor seal diet. So there's some uncertainty there. But yeah, and unlike most predators, we do have a good long-term time series on the pinniped numbers in BC.
Yeah, I realize that the salmon doesn't make up a big part of the pinniped diet, but it doesn't have to be much when you have a species under a threat like steelhead and salmon in BC. Do you think that the minister has had a recommendation made to her that there should be some type of management of pinniped populations to protect salmonoid species in British Columbia and, in fact, in Atlantic Canada as well?
Yeah, my understanding is that that's been proposed to the minister or brought forward, yeah.
Interesting. My next question, I heard Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Chair, I'd like this one for Mr. Reynolds. He spoke a lot about sea lice. Now, if I were a salmon, I'd be much more afraid of a pinniped chasing me than a sea lice. You also talked about trade-offs in some of these management decisions. Could you give us an example of a trade-off that might be made in terms of addressing the risk of pinnipeds on salmonoid populations?
So you're looking for what would be the downside of controlling pinnipeds?
In terms of, I heard you mention people harmed by trade-offs in decisions. What human aspect would there be to controlling pinniped populations?
I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on pinnipeds. I've never studied them, so not really sure what the trade-off would be there. It certainly would, but I can see where you're coming from in terms of compared to, say, the trade-off of livelihoods affected by reduced fishing and so on. I don't see those sorts of trade-offs, but otherwise, I suspect perhaps the biggest barrier might be the concern of many members of the public that like pinnipeds. How exactly
hurt feelings
should. Yes, and so how the minister weighs that, of course, is why they, that's a tough question to deal with and not really a scientific one.
No. We're all creatures.
Thank you, Mr. Small.
I'm
Your
done.
5 minutes don't be long going when you're having fun. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 5 minutes or less, please.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. It's John Reynolds.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I really do need to return to my CASIWIC meeting. So, if it's okay, I would like to be allowed to be let off the hook here, if that's all right, please.
Yeah, it's a good analogy for this committee to let someone off the hook. But no, thank you for your participation. It was greatly appreciated. And you feel free to sign off whenever you want. So we'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 5 minutes or less, please.
Yeah, my thanks to Mr. Reynolds and the rest of the fascinating witnesses. And to think that 6 months ago I wouldn't have been able to tell you what a pinniped was. And Mr. Chair, I will be sharing my time with Ms. May, so I'll have 2.5 minutes. And I wanted to go back to Mr. Oldford. Thanks for being here. And I noticed in your profile that your research interests include parameter estimation, uncertainty analysis, and modeling ecological networks. And given that it seems one of the linchpins for how science in DFO gets translated into options and recommendations is through this scientific advice report. But where you have varying quality of science and you have uncertain data, I wonder if you can describe some of the challenges in collating uncertainties and inconsistencies into advice based on science, and how you would use the tools such as uncertainty analysis and parameter estimation to inform that advice.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It isn't easy to navigate. It's especially in ecology, the time series and data we have are often very sparse, and we're starting to see good examples of long-term time series available for us to work with, and we're trying to incorporate them into the models. Often those time series and those observations don't come with a good understanding of exactly what the error is on them. So there is some struggle there putting, for example, a probability or a precise likelihood to, say, a management strategy that management wishes to evaluate. So there are ongoing challenges with that, and I think it's just something that may always be there. The other thing I'd like to say about that is that it's almost a caveat. The simulation modeling and computer modeling does play an outsized role in ecology, marine ecology, partially because you can't isolate variables. You can't do controlled experiments as easily. But they are just models at the end of the day. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I'll now cede to Ms. May.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Hanley, for giving me some of your time. I'm with 2.5 minutes ambitiously going to try to put 2 questions to 2 different witnesses, so here's hoping. First, to Dr. Moran, your evidence and your recommendations to this committee included that, drawing on your experience in the White House, that we look at what we could do better about our most neglected ocean coastline and our ocean and the Arctic. Dr. Robert also referenced that the data deficiencies for Arctic fisheries are quite high. Could you briefly cover in a bit more detail what you think the federal government should be doing in relation to the Arctic?
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, I think there are many interests across federal departments in the Arctic. And as we've experienced at Ocean Networks Canada, we operate infrastructure that benefits many federal departments. We need to use our dollars wisely to put in as much autonomous systems as possible in the Arctic that then deliver information across those mandates. For example, it's situational awareness is critical in the Arctic, as is understanding the changing climate, as is understanding the fisheries. So getting those players together, identifying the needs, and then putting in systems in many areas along our coast. Many have to be autonomous to actually gather that information.
Thank you. And I've been fortunate, committee members, to have visited Ocean Network Canada frequently, and it's mind-blowing to see what their equipment is capable of doing at sensing on the ocean floor. My question to Dr. Mordecai is to pick up on his comment that there's a conflict of interest problem that is suppressing science in DFO, and particularly in relation to PRV, but also sea lice, and we also heard evidence on suppression of science on this interior of Fraser steelhead. Dr. Mordecai, could you explain what, maybe it's not something you can actually speculate, but what the heck would be the conflict of interest between a department that's supposed to protect our fisheries and our coastline that ends up deciding that to have decision-based evidence-making instead of what we want, evidence-based decision-making?
I'd say the conflict would go down to the duality in the mandate of DFO, which is to obviously look after wild fish and fisheries, but also to regulate and promote the aquaculture industry. And there'll be cases where those things come head to head, and that is where the conflict comes about.
I think my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gone over slightly, but we'll forgive you for that today. We have to close off now at this point because, of course, Mr. Zimmer has provided us with a notice of motion that we have to deal with. So we'll say thank you to our witnesses for their informed participation here at committee today. It's been absolutely fantastic and fantastic testimony and information. It's been very good, including the seals and the sea lice part. But so I'll give our witnesses a moment to sign off, and we'll go into a bit of committee business for Mr. Zimmer's motion.
We're good to go?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Okay, I think everybody has signed off, Mr. Zimmer, but what I will say from the onset is that your notice of motion, being that it wasn't the topic for today, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent for you to be able to move your motion, and I don't think you'll find much of a problem with that. So do I have unanimous consent for Mr. Zimmer moving his motion? Okay, hearing none.
Thank you, merci.
You're good to go, sir.
Well, thank you, everybody. And I trust that you've seen the motion. We sent it out last week, and I'm just going to read it. That the committee requests the Parliamentary Budget Officer prepare research and comparative analysis on the estimates for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans beginning at least as early as 2015 to 2016 to 2022 to 2023. And that the committee requests that this research and analysis be submitted to the committee within 60 days following the adoption of this motion. And really the gist of it, folks, is what's typical practice in my office. We meet the PBO, especially in my role as critic. I'm critic for other files. And we just have a little conversation with PBO. And just and asked about some questions around fisheries and oceans, and that this comparative analysis had not been done, and that I would need to come to committee just to make the request to get them to do kind of their work on it. So I don't think there's anything in there that's should be concerned to any of us other than just having a simple look at what those expenditures are. So I think Ms. Barron had a comment, though, she wanted to make. So sorry, through the chair. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I had a question for Mr. Zimmer and also an amendment that was sent out. So perhaps I'll ask the question first, and then, Chair, I'll wait for you to let me know when I can speak to the amendment. But the question that I had was, I'm curious to know what the next steps would be after this motion. Are we looking for the Parliamentary Budget Officer to appear and speak to the information that's being gathered, or what are the next steps that would come?
Yeah, I don't believe that's part of the process. This would just be offering us the document of what he comes up with, or what the PBO's really just beyond one person, but it's a department. But that we would just be asking for that document to be provided. I don't envision him appearing, or I mean that could be part of it, but that's not what the motion is asking for. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Basically asking for them to write a report based on the motion.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. And could I speak to the amendment?
Yes, the motion has been moved. We can certainly move an amendment, but Madam
Simplement signifier qu'on l'a pas reçu.
I would just like to point out that we haven't received the text. We haven't received the amendment. So it would be helpful to receive it in both languages, please.
Because it hasn't been made yet.
To clarify, the amendment, it is my understanding, has been received by the clerk. And
Distribute it till you move it. She'll distribute
can I move the amendment, please?
And the amendment is?
The amendment is, do you want me to read the whole thing or just where the changes are? So the amendment, I'll just read the whole thing and where the changes are. That the committee requests the parliamentary budget officer prepare research and comparative analysis on the estimates for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans beginning at least as early as, and here's the change, 2011 to 2012 to 2022-23, and that the committee requests that this research and analysis be submitted to the committee within 60 days following the adoption of this motion. Chair, can I speak to the amendment?
Unless you can, I guess, if you want to
Okay,
explain
just wanna make sure I'm
why
following
you're
process.
doing the amendment.
Yes, thank you. So very minor change. It's just the change of the dates, and the rationale is that I support the motion and agree we need a comparative analysis. We know that we see change happen very slowly from decisions that we make today. They might take many years to come to fruition, so I think having it extended in length will provide us with a more fruitful piece of information.
We've all heard the amendment and the explanation for it. I know we're getting tight on time to get this through. I'm not seeing any hands up for any further discussion. So can we have a vote on the amendment, please? Oh, yes, yeah, or could, unless it can be adopted unanimously or on division, or all thumbs up? Okay, the amendment is approved unanimously, and the motion as amended? Unanimous as well. Excellent. We should have such an easy time on all votes. Oh, definitely, definitely. Mr. Arnold.
Just before you adjourn, Mr. Chair, as we're proceeding with the science study, I'd just like to ask if the minister has been invited to this current study yet.
I thought the understanding was to have her near the end of the study, and so because the time's been spread out a little bit because of draft reports, it'll be a little while. Yeah, I don't know when exactly, but near the end for sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everybody.
Not a problem. Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. I want to say a big thank you to all the staff involved in today's meeting, especially our interpreters, clerk, and analyst, and everybody that supports us individually. Meeting adjourned.